They tell you when you join the Corps of Temporal Engineers that time is neutral. It doesn't care who you are, where you come from, or what you think you deserve. It just moves, and you either move with it or you get left behind. I used to believe that. I used to think it was almost comforting, that indifference. Then I spent 3 weeks on Calderon's frontier and learned that time wasn't the thing trying to kill me. That was the Vethori. I should back up. My name is Marty Flynn. I was 22 years old when I made the jump to Calderon's frontier, which is what the Survey Corps had labeled the planet before anyone had the sense to admit it was already occupied. I was not a soldier. I was a courier and a mechanic's assistant, which meant I fixed things that broke and delivered things that mattered, and I did not carry a weapon larger than a utility knife. I wore a Survey Corps patch on my jacket, and I knew how to solder a relay junction in microgravity, and I could calculate transit vectors in my head fast enough to be useful, and that was the sum of my professional qualifications. I was not anyone's first choice for a rescue operation. I worked for a man named Emmett Cole. Dr. Emmett Cole, though he hated the title, said it made people expect him to have answers instead of better questions. He was the most brilliant and most catastrophically unlucky man I have ever known, and I have known some competition for that distinction in the years since. He had built the transit capsule that made the jump to Calderon's frontier possible. He had calculated the window, designed the drive, sourced the components through 3 different black market contacts, because the colonial authority wasn't funding speculative survey work that year. He had done everything right. Then a plasma storm hit the capsule on re-entry, fried the return drive, and left him stranded on Calderon's frontier in a period roughly equivalent to a century before any human ship would think to look. He had been there for 3 months when I got his letter. The letter found me on Relay Station 11, which orbited a gas giant 2 jumps from Calderon, and smelled permanently of recycled air and synthetic coffee, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being technically connected to civilization without being in it. I was between assignments. I had been ferrying survey data for a geological team, and the geological team had wrapped early, and I was waiting on my next tasking, and spending my evenings reading and thinking about how I was going to spend the next 40 years of my life. The message pod was in my assigned mailbox. I almost didn't open it that night. I almost left it for morning. I have thought about that a lot in the years since, how close the whole thing came to not happening. I read the letter standing in the cargo bay with the recycled air blowing cold against my neck. His handwriting was precise and slightly cramped, the writing of a man who had spent decades filling notebooks that were never going to be large enough. He was alive. He had survived the landing. The capsule was buried in the 3rd ravine east of the settlement he called Pine Haven, and the hull was intact, and the drive array was recoverable. And if I could get the replacement drive components from the Survey Corps depot on Station 11 and make the jump in the backup capsule without triggering the Vethori perimeter sensors, there was a chance, a narrow one, he wrote, and he always underestimated narrowness, that I could extract him before the return window closed. The window was 7 days from the date I received the letter. I would have 6 days on the ground. What he did not mention in the letter, because he probably thought it would stop me, was that Buford Tan was already looking for him. Tan was a Vethori enforcer. That word, enforcer, does not carry enough weight in our language to describe what Tan actually was. The Vethori had a caste structure built around what they called the right of correction, which was their term for a system of legally sanctioned violence that the colonial authority had agreed to tolerate under the terms of the Calderon Compact. The history of that agreement is long and inglorious, and involves political pressures I am not qualified to fully describe. The short version is this. 40 years ago, the colonial authority needed access to the mineral extraction rights in the western basin of Calderon's frontier, and the Vethori Governing Council offered a deal, and the deal included a provision that allowed Vethori enforcers to challenge any human who committed a defined offense against the hierarchy. The challenge was formalized. It was recorded in a ledger, and it was almost always lethal. Any Vethori of sufficient standing could issue a formal challenge. The challenged human was required to present themselves at an appointed time and location for what the compact called an exchange. The exchange was, in practice, a killing. The human could theoretically decline, but the penalty for declining was collective sanction against their settlement, and no one in the settlements had ever been willing to carry that particular weight. Tan was the senior enforcer for the Western Basin. He was tall, they were all tall, the Vethori, 2.5 meters of layered muscle and dense cartilage bone that made conventional projectile weapons largely a nuisance rather than a stopping threat. You had to hit them in very specific places, with very specific calibers, at ranges that put you close enough for them to reach you before you could reload. Their biology was not human. Their cardiovascular system was distributed differently, their pain response operated on a different neurological pathway, and the cartilage plates across their chest and shoulders were dense enough to stop a standard Survey Corps sidearm flat. They smelled context the way we see color. They had olfactory receptors that processed emotional information from the air, which meant they could literally smell when you were afraid, when you were angry, when you were desperate. It made them exceptional interrogators and deeply unsettling dinner companions. Tan had been doing this work for 30 years. He had the flat, pale eyes of a predator that has never once been surprised by its prey. He wore his kill count on a sash across his chest. I never counted it directly, but the people in Pinehaven who had dealt with him longer told me the number was somewhere in the high 20s. Doc Cole had made the mistake, in his first weeks on Calderon's frontier, of failing to bow to Tan in the street. Not a defiant refusal, not a statement, not a considered act of resistance. He simply hadn't known the protocol, because the protocol was not in the survey data, and he had been awake for 40 hours and was trying to locate food and potable water. And Tan walked past on the settlement's main thoroughfare, and Doc looked up instead of down. That was the offense. Tan gave him a formal challenge the same day, 12 days to make his affairs in order. I arrived on day 9. The transit capsule set down in a dry gulch 8 kilometers from the settlement, which was where the jump window put me, and where the sensor blind spot that Doc had identified in his letter allowed me to land without triggering the Vethori perimeter. I ran through the post-jump check fast, hull integrity, drive status, emergency protocols, and then I cracked the hatch. The sky hit me first. It was wide and red-dusted and absolutely empty in a way that skis in settled space never are. No orbital platforms, no shipping lanes, no grid lights on the horizon. Just cloud formations that looked like smeared ochre paint, and a sun that was 30% larger than Earth standard and threw everything into this deep amber light that made shadows look like old bruises and made distances hard to judge. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're indifferent to you. I stood in the hatch for a moment and felt small in a specific way I had not felt since the first time I stepped out of a transit capsule into open space. Then I saw the Vethori patrol, 4 of them, moving along the ridgeline 200 meters up. I stayed in the gulch for 40 minutes until they passed, watching them through the capsule's sensor display, not moving, not breathing particularly hard. They had a long, unhurried stride that covered ground faster than it looked like it should. They did not glance down into the gulch. Their patrol route was not looking for hidden capsules. It was looking for humans who needed correcting. Pinehaven was a human settlement, one of 6 in the Western Basin, clustered near the water tables in the low country between the ridge systems. It had been there for 40 years. The humans who lived there had built real things in that time, houses with actual foundations. A grid that ran off the geothermal tap, a school, a medical station, a water filtration system that Doc Cole had apparently been maintaining for the past 3 months. They had gardens. They had a communal hall with long tables. They had children who had been born there and had never seen Earth and thought of the amber sky as normal. They had also learned to coexist with the Vethori the way you learn to coexist with a bad knee. You accommodate it constantly. You never forget it's there. Every morning you wake up and make a private calculation about how much it's going to cost you today, and you decide whether that cost is within your range, and you proceed accordingly. They were not broken people. I want to be clear about that. The people of Pinehaven were not beaten down and hollow. They were tired and careful and very, very good at reading a room. They had built real lives in those careful spaces. They loved their children and they maintained their infrastructure, and they found ways to laugh at things that weren't funny, which is its own kind of strength. I walked the main thoroughfare of Pinehaven for the first time on the morning I arrived, and what struck me was how ordinary it looked. I had been building a picture in my head from survey data and Doc's letter, a frontier settlement, alien-occupied under the heel of an enforcer caste, and I had imagined something visibly oppressed, something that wore its circumstances in the way of its architecture or its faces. But the houses were maintained. The thoroughfare was swept clean. 2 children ran past me chasing something that had gotten loose from whatever enclosure they'd been keeping it in, and they ran the way children always run, which is to say carelessly and with complete commitment, and nobody looked up. A man repaired a gutter brace on the roof of a building to my left, balanced on a narrow ledge with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times. A woman hung laundry in the flat amber light. Normal things. Careful, earned, hard-maintained normal things. That was what the compact had built, I thought. Not ruins, not visible misery. Just this steady, relentless accommodation that had been going on for 40 years and would keep going on until someone changed the math. But they had also stopped thinking about fighting back so long ago that the idea didn't register as an option anymore. It registered as noise from somewhere very far away, like thunder from a storm that's already past you. Doc Cole was in his workshop at the edge of town. He had, in 3 months, made himself indispensable to the settlement's mechanical infrastructure. Not strategically, that was not how Emmett Cole operated. He had simply looked at the things that were broken and fixed them, and then he had looked at the things that were inefficient and improved them. And by the time I arrived, he was maintaining the water pumps, the filtration array, the geothermal taps distribution system, and the wiring harness of the community hall. He was wearing a leather apron and had grease on both forearms up to the elbow, and he looked, when I walked through the workshop door, like a man who had been genuinely surprised to discover he was happy. That was the thing about Emmett Cole. He could find traction anywhere. Give him a problem and a set of basic tools and he was home. The fact that he was stranded a century from his own time on a world actively hostile to his species was a problem, and he had been solving it with the same focused attention he brought to everything else, and in the process he had built something he had not quite planned on. He stopped being happy when he saw my face. Not because he was unhappy to see me. I knew him well enough to read the relief in the set of his shoulders, the thing that let go when I walked in. He stopped being happy because seeing me meant the situation was real in a way it had perhaps been theoretical before. "You came," he said. "You wrote me a letter." "I wrote you a letter telling you not to come." I remembered the letter differently. I told him so. He gave me the look he gave people when he was certain he was right and suspected the argument would not be resolved by logic. He pulled off his gloves and sat down on a workbench and looked at me for a long time. I had been looked at like that before. It was the look he got when he was running the numbers and not enjoying where they landed. "How long do you have the capsule?" he said. 6 days before the return window closes. The replacement drive. I pulled the component from my pack and set it on the bench between us. He picked it up, turned it in his hands with the particular care he gave to things that mattered. Something moved across his face that I couldn't quite name, relief, maybe, and something harder underneath it. "We have a problem," he said. "Tan. You know about Tan. I know you have 3 days." He set the drive component down. "The challenge is formal. If I don't appear for the exchange, he's authorized to designate a secondary. He'll name one of the settlement residents. They'll be obligated under the compact to stand in my place or face collective sanction. He was quiet for a moment. I can't run and leave that behind me. I sat down. The amber light came through the workshop's one window and made everything look like old photographs. Can we get the capsule running in 3 days? I've had 3 months to think about the problem, he said. The capsule's power cell is compatible with the replacement drive, but the transit rail that initiates the jump sequence requires a sustained acceleration that the capsule's own engine can't produce. It's not a question of the drive component. It's a question of getting the capsule to threshold velocity. I looked around the workshop, at the tools, the materials, the components he'd accumulated over 3 months of making himself useful. What have you got to work with? He smiled. It was a thin smile and it had something tired behind it, but it was real. There's a Vethori freight hauler, he said. Electromagnetic traction system. Runs on a fixed track between Pinehaven and the eastern extraction site. If we can get the capsule onto that track and get the hauler to push it. Tan will know. Tan will know, he agreed. But not until after. The sensors on the freight system log activation events, but the logs are reviewed at the end of the day cycle. If we time the departure for early morning, we'll have hours before anyone reviews the records. He paused, assuming everything works. And if it doesn't? He looked at me steadily. We'll be standing next to a wrecked transit capsule on a Vethori freight track with an enforcer scheduled to arrive at dawn. So it's important that it works. 3 days. We had 3 days to rig a dead transit capsule to the side of an alien freight rail and pray the physics held together, while a 2.5-meter enforcer with 30 years of kill count waited for his scheduled opportunity to demonstrate Vethori superiority to a settlement full of people who had made their peace with looking at the ground. I am not by nature an optimist, but I have spent years working with Emmett Cole, and I have learned that optimism is not the operative variable. What matters is whether the numbers can be made to work, and if they can't, whether you can change the numbers. We started working. The capsule was in worse shape than Doc's letter had suggested, because Doc's letters always framed the situation in the most constructive light available, which was both an admirable quality and an occasionally dangerous one. The hull had taken serious ablative scoring along the port side from the plasma storm. 2 lateral thrusters had burned out completely on re-entry. The sensor array was cracked and would need bypassing rather than repair. None of that affected the jump itself, but it meant we were hauling dead weight, and the freight hauler's traction system was calibrated for specific load tolerances that we were going to exceed. Doc had already calculated the overage. It made him wince, but he thought the track could handle it. We also had the problem of the schedule. The Vethori freight hauler ran on a fixed timetable. Any deviation would be flagged. If we tried to commandeer the hauler outside the scheduled window, Vethori security would have people at the spur within 20 minutes. If we used the scheduled run as cover, we'd have to time the capsule's placement precisely and get clear before the hauler reached the extraction site terminus. Doc had been thinking about this for 3 months. He had a plan. The plan involved a fuel enhancement compound he'd synthesized from materials available in the settlement stores, 3 compressed canisters, installable in the hauler's firebox. That would push the output well past rated capacity for a sustained window of approximately 90 seconds. That was the physics problem solved, if the canisters performed as calculated. 90 seconds of emergency thrust to get the capsule from standstill to transit threshold. I had concerns about the margin. Doc reminded me, with characteristic patience, that I had flown through a Vethori sensor perimeter in a capsule held together with third-party components and institutional optimism, which suggested my tolerance for marginal situations was more robust than I was currently presenting. We worked through the first night. The settlement went quiet after dark. The Vethori did not move at night, something to do with their visual biology and the way their olfactory system relied on environmental light cues that degraded in darkness. The humans of Pinehaven had learned to treat those hours as a kind of breathing space, granted by circumstance if not by design. The nights were theirs in a way the days were not. People came to the workshop. They brought food and water and did not ask questions, which was its own kind of generosity. A woman named Ilara, who ran the settlement's medical station, came by twice. She was quiet and precise in her movements, and she checked on Doc both times with the manner of someone who had been watching out for him for a while. She did not look at me directly either visit, which I understood to mean she knew about Tan, and had already run her calculations about what was likely to happen in the next 3 days. On the morning of the second day, Tan came to the workshop. He arrived at the main hour when the settlement was moving. He had 2 of his people with him, younger Vethori subordinates, the kind who were still building their sashes. He stood in the doorway and took in the workshop with the particular Vethori assessment process, chin slightly elevated, eyes making that slow lateral sweep, nostrils working at the air. They smelled context. That was one of the things that made them genuinely alien, not their size or their bone structure, but the way they processed a space through emotional residue left in the air. They knew when humans had been afraid in a room. They knew when we'd been angry or desperate or hopeful. I wondered, standing there with a circuit board in my hands, what the accumulated 3 months of Emmett Cole's presence smelled like. Whether they could smell the specific quality of a man who had found something worth staying for. Smithson, Tan said, using the name Doc had been working under. You have not made your preparations. Doc set down his tools and looked at Tan. He had this quality about him that I had noticed in all my years working with him, this absolute refusal to be physically diminished by whoever was in the room. He was not a large man. He was, if I am being honest, slightly below average height, and had the build of someone who had spent most of his life at a workbench. But he looked at Tan the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved and is somewhat bored by. My preparations are my own concern, he said. Tan's eyes moved to me. They were pale, almost colorless, and moved with a precision that reminded me of targeting systems. This one is new, he said. My associate, Doc said. He did not present himself for registration. I'll see to it today, I said. I kept my voice flat. Flat was better than anything else in my assessment. Tan looked at me for what felt like a prepared amount of time. Not spontaneous, measured, deliberate, the way everything he did was deliberate. Beside him, the 2 subordinates were still. The exchange is at dawn 2 days hence, he said finally, returning to Doc. First light, the settlement square. He paused, and what came next was delivered with a quietness that was more effective than volume. I have ended better men than you, Smithson, quickly and without ceremony. It is the only mercy I extend. He turned and left. The 2 subordinates followed. The workshop door swung shut behind them. I realized I had been holding the circuit board at a slightly odd angle. I set it down. He's going to kill you, I said. Not if we're gone before dawn. And if the rig doesn't work. Doc was already back at his calculations. Then we have a different problem, he said. Let's make the rig work. We worked through the second day and into the second night. The plan was taking solid shape. The canister installation, the timing sequence, the departure window. Doc had run the calculations so many times that he could do it from memory, which he sometimes did aloud, walking through the variables while I worked on the capsule's transit array. I had learned years ago that this was how he managed anxiety. He ran the numbers until they became a kind of mantra, and the mantra kept the fear at a manageable distance. The thing that went wrong that evening was not mechanical. I should have anticipated it. I should have built contingency into my thinking for it. But I was 22 and running on stimulant tabs, and I had been in crisis mode for 36 hours straight. And when Doc set down his tools around the 4th hour of the night cycle and said he needed to go speak with Clara, I thought it was a short errand. Clara's name was Clara Reyes. She ran the settlement's education station, classes for the 40-some children who had been born on Calderon's frontier and had never seen Earth, and were learning what the universe was from a woman who had made it her life's work to show them. She was the one who had asked Emmett Cole, 3 months ago, to fix the education station's water pump, and he had fixed it in 2 hours and then stayed 6 more hours because she had a shelf of books that included a collected edition of an author he had loved since he was 15, and she had read all of them. He had talked about her the way people talk about things they've decided they're allowed to want, carefully, briefly, as if mentioning it too much would use it up. He had gone to her to say goodbye, and he had told her the truth, who he was, where he was from, when he was from, why he was leaving. He had told her because she deserved that, and because he was constitutionally incapable of lying to people he respected, and because some part of him hoped she would believe him. She had not believed him. She had looked at him and said he was constructing a story to have a reason to leave, and she had closed the door. He came back to the workshop at the 3rd hour of the night and sat on the bench with his hands in his lap and looked at the floor. The workshop was lit by the portable units we'd strung along the ceiling, and they cast a flat, even light that made everything look undramatic, which was the wrong light for what was on his face. I gave him a minute, then I sat down next to him. "Tell me," I said. He told me. I listened. He had an extraordinary clarity about painful things, Emmett Cole. He could describe what had happened without softening it or dramatizing it, just the facts in the order they occurred and what they meant, and it was worse for the precision somehow. "She's not wrong that you're leaving," I said when he finished. "She's wrong about why." "I know." He looked at the floor. "I spent 3 months here," he said. "I fixed things, I built things. I had conversations I didn't expect to have with someone I didn't expect to meet. I know what that is. I'm not confused about what it is. But I also know what I am, which is a man from somewhere else who has no business building something he can't stay to maintain." He was quiet for a moment. And yet, I did not have anything useful to say to that. I was 22 years old, and my understanding of what it cost to leave something you had built was entirely theoretical. I sat next to him in the flat light, and we were both quiet for a while. "We have to finish the rig," I said finally. He looked up. "Yes," he said, "we do." There is a kind of grief that does not stop you from working. It just rides along beside you, patient and quiet, and you carry it and do the work. And the work doesn't make the grief less, but it makes it bearable because it gives you something to put your hands on. I watched Doc carry it through the rest of that night. He was meticulous. He was precise. He was the best mechanic I had ever worked beside, and he was all of that while carrying something that would have shut other people down entirely. And I filed that away because it was something I had not fully understood before. By the 3rd hour of the morning, the rig was complete, capsule positioned at the head of the freight spur, accelerant canisters installed, drive component locked in. Doc had run the final check sequence twice, and I had run it once independently, and we had cross-checked our results, and the margin was acceptable. We were ready. Then I found him at the saloon. He had walked there somewhere around the 4th hour, while I was doing a final inspection of the canister installation. I found the workshop empty, and I spent 40 minutes checking obvious places before I thought to check the obvious one. The saloon was a low building on the settlement's western side, permitted by the Vethori for the reason that human social congregation in one location was easier to monitor than humans dispersed through the settlement at all hours. It was not a sophisticated watering hole. It was 4 walls and a bar, and a collection of chairs, and the particular atmosphere of a place where people came to be around other people without needing to explain themselves. Doc was at the bar with a glass in front of him. He had the look of a man having a conversation with himself that he was losing. I sat down next to him. "We need to go," I said. "She deserved better," he said. "She did, and you told her the truth. You didn't give her a story." I told her something true that she had no tools to believe. That's a different kind of problem, but the result is the same. He looked at the glass. 40 years from now, there will be survey data on this settlement. There will be records. There will be things that make it possible to verify what I told her. But that's 40 years from now, and she's here and I'm here and... Doc. He stopped. Drink your drink or don't. We need to leave. He picked up the glass. He had been holding it for hours without drinking it. I could see by the stillness of the liquid inside that he hadn't touched it. He drank it, one swallow, set it down, and then his eyes went slightly unfocused and he slid sideways off the stool. I caught him before he hit the floor. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Kell who had the neutral efficiency of someone who had survived 40 years on Calderon's frontier, by never quite seeing anything he wasn't supposed to, came around the bar fast and produced a small vial of something dark and pungent from under the counter with the air of a man who kept it there for a reason. We got it under Doc's nose, and he came back in 90 seconds, coughing and swearing in a way that was both alarming and reassuring. Alcohol intolerance, I told Kell. Notice that, Kell said. 3 months and first drink. Thought he might be holding out for a special occasion. Doc was still getting oriented when the saloon door opened. Tan came in first. He had 3 people with him this time. He stepped inside and took the room, not a sweep exactly, but an assessment, complete and fast, the way their vision worked. His eyes settled on Doc. They moved to me. They came back to Doc. "You're early," Doc said. His voice was still compromised by the whiskey and the revival compound and the general conditions of the preceding hour, but it had that quality, that flat, unimpressed register, like a man solving something instead of fearing it. "I do not keep your schedule," Tan said. He reached into his coat and produced the sidearm. It was short-barreled and enormous by human standards, and at this range the physics were brutally straightforward. The exchange occurs now. I was standing between them. I do not remember deciding to stand between them. I was at the bar, and then I was between Doc and Tan, and the bar was behind me, and Tan's pale eyes were doing their assessment, reading whatever I was putting into the air. What he read there must have been unexpected, because he stopped. Not dramatically, just stopped and looked at me with a recalibration behind his eyes. "Step aside," he said. "No." One word. I've thought about it many times. There was no heroism in it, I want to be clear about that. There was no calculation of odds or assessment of outcomes. There was just the word, sitting between us in the saloon air, stubborn as bad weather. Tan's cartilage plates shifted. Stress response, the biological equivalent of squaring up. "You are not party to this exchange," he said. "He's not fighting you," I said. "You want to fight tonight, you challenge me." The silence that followed occupied the room the way water occupies a vessel, filling every corner, finding every gap. The other people in the saloon had gone very still. Tan's 3 subordinates were reading each other in that lateral Vethori way. Tan himself was doing something I had not seen him do. He was genuinely processing a situation that had not been scheduled. "You are a courier," he said after a long moment. He had done his research. "You are untrained. You have no combat classification." "That's right. I would end you before you understood what was happening." "Probably," I said, "but it's my choice to make." He did not challenge me. I saw the decision move across his face, and I want to be accurate about what it was. Not mercy, not respect, calculation. I was an unscheduled variable, and I was offering him a situation with costs he had not assessed. Killing me solved nothing. I was not the original offense. And there was something else, something I could see him working on even as he looked at me. Something about the room. About Kell and the other people in the saloon who had all gone still and were watching. About the way the air probably smelled. "Dawn," Tan said finally. His eyes moved over my shoulder to Doc. "The exchange stands. You will present yourself at first light, Smithson, or I will designate a secondary." He held it there. The The teacher, he said. She is registered as a capable adult in the settlement ledger. She will serve. He turned and left. The door swung shut. The saloon held its silence for 3 full seconds. Doc was on his feet. The revival compound had done its work, and his eyes were clear, and they had the particular look they got when a problem had become personal in a way that engaged something deeper than professional interest. "Clara," he said. "He won't use her," I said. "He wants you. He'll use her the moment we run." I looked at Doc. He looked at me. The ambient amber of the saloon lights made everything look like something from a long time ago. "Then we don't run," I said. "We do something else." I pulled my comm unit. "We have 4 hours until dawn. The rig is ready. And we have one thing Tan doesn't have." "Tell me," Doc said. "He thinks he knows what we're going to do." There is a particular pleasure in explaining a plan to someone who immediately improves on it. I laid out the framework in 10 minutes. Doc took it and made it better in another 15. And by the time we left the saloon with Kel watching us go from behind his bar, we had a sequence that had a better margin than anything I'd designed on my own. I will say this about Emmett Cole. He did not waste time on the elegance of a plan when the plan needed to work. He was not the kind of engineer who fell in love with his designs. He was the kind who tested them until they failed and then rebuilt them stronger at the failure point. And when I described what I was thinking, he immediately went to the failure points. The timing window, the sensor log delay, the load variance on the track, the question of whether Tan had a standing patrol at the freight spur that I hadn't accounted for. He ran through each one. He had answers for 3 of them immediately, and worked out the 4th while we were still in the saloon, scrawling numbers on the back of a delivery receipt that Kel had left on the bar. I watched him work and thought, this is why I came, not because I thought I could save him, because I thought he could save himself if someone gave him the right components at the right time. That had always been the job. It was still the job. We went back to the workshop. The settlement was quiet and dark, and the amber sky overhead had shifted to the deep bruise color it went before dawn. Tan came to the square at first light with 6 of his people. I was there. Doc was there. And when I turned around, I saw that 40 people were also there, settlers, most of the adult population of Pinehaven, standing in the square in the early morning chill with their breath visible in the air. They had heard what was happening. Word moved in Pinehaven at night, in the hours when the Vethori weren't watching, and 40 people had gotten up before dawn and come to stand in a public square and witness what was going to happen. Tan read the crowd the way he read every room, something adjusted in his posture, subtle, barely visible, but there. He had wanted this to be quiet. They always wanted it to be quiet. Quiet enforcement was a different thing than public enforcement. He adjusted. He was good at adjusting, but it cost him. He addressed Doc with the formal challenge recitation. It was long. The Vethori legal language had its own cadence, and Tan delivered it without hurry. Because the deliberateness was part of the function, it was meant to establish the authority, the inevitability, the fact that what was happening had been determined by processes larger than either of the individuals in the square. When he finished, he looked at Doc and waited. Doc said, "I decline." The words went into the air and stayed there. Tan went very still. "The Calderon Compact," Doc said, "Provision 12, subsection 4. An individual designated for formal exchange may decline engagement and submit to correctional penalty instead. Penalty to be assessed by the presiding enforcer and recorded in the compact ledger. The penalty may not include termination." He had spent his first weeks on Calderon's frontier in the settlement archive, because it was the largest collection of written material he could access, and he had read everything in it, including the full text of the Calderon Compact, all 17 provisions and their subsections, because Emmett Cole read everything and retained it, and filed it under the assumption that knowing things was always better than not knowing them. The silence in the square was unlike anything I have experienced before or since. 40 people were holding their breath. Tan's 6 subordinates were communicating in that lateral Vethori way, faster than I could follow. Tan himself had gone the particular quality of still that is not calm, but its opposite, the stillness of a system processing an unexpected input. The penalty, Tan said at last, very carefully, is at my discretion. Within the parameters of the ledger, Doc said, yes. What followed was not quick. Tan had to actually think, publicly, in front of 6 subordinates and 40 human witnesses, about a provision of the compact he had never expected to need. He could not kill Doc without invalidating his own legal standing. He could not ignore the invocation without violating the same authority that gave him his role. He could assess a correctional penalty, labor, resource forfeit, public censure. But whatever he assessed would go into the ledger, and the ledger was shared with the colonial authority. And there was a version of this that became documentation, and documentation had a way of becoming questions. And Tan had operated for 30 years in the space between what was technically recorded and what was actually done. He assessed a labor penalty, 3 months of settlement infrastructure maintenance to be rendered under supervision. Doc accepted it. I'll need my tools, he said. Tan's eyes moved to me. He had done the arithmetic. I had interfered in an authorized exchange the previous night at the saloon. That was an independent actionable offense under the compact. He said. I invoke provision 12, I said. I had 4 hours to prepare for this moment, and I had spent part of those hours sitting in the workshop thinking about what it felt like to look at Tan and not look at the ground. Not the fighting. I had no illusions about that. I was 22 years old and I was not trained, and he was right that I would not have understood what was happening before it was over. Not the bravery. Just the specific arithmetic of the situation. What Tan could do in a public square, in front of 40 witnesses and a colonial authority ledger, versus what he was permitted to do. The answer to that arithmetic was correctional penalty. He assessed me the same penalty he'd assessed Doc, 3 months, infrastructure maintenance, under supervision. The square was absolutely quiet. Tan looked at us. He looked at the 40 people behind us. I cannot know what he smelled in the air of that square, what emotional residue 40 people produced when they watched 2 men decline to be killed on schedule and walk away. But I saw it register on his face, whatever it was. Not fear. Not respect, not yet, and not in the way that word usually means. Something more like the recalibration I had seen in the saloon. A recognition that the variables in this settlement had changed in some way that was not yet fully assessed. He turned and left. His 6 people followed. The square remained full for a long time after. Nobody moved to go. They just stood there in the amber morning light, 40 people. And something was happening in the air between them that I could not name precisely, but that I recognized the shape of the specific weight of people who have just watched something and are figuring out what it means. Alara found me at the edge of the square. She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. She handed me a flat package, food, medical supplies, folded inside it a piece of paper. In case you need the exit corridor on your way out, she said. The paper was a map of the Vethori sensor grid, annotated in a precise hand with a corridor marked through the eastern ridge. I looked up at her. We've known about it for 20 years, she said. We just hadn't had a reason to use it. Clara was at the freight spur when we arrived. I don't know exactly when she figured it out. The model transit capsule in Doc's workshop, probably. She had apparently gone there looking for him that morning, and found the model on the bench with its components labeled in Doc's precise handwriting. And she was a woman who had read everything she could find about physics and space travel, and the theoretical possibility of jumping between moments in time, because she was that kind of person, and she had looked at the model and understood what it was. She was standing at the head of the track when we came with the capsule, and she looked at Doc, and he looked at her, and I found something extremely demanding to attend to on the starboard side of the capsule hull that required my complete focus for the next several minutes. I caught pieces of what they said. The morning was still and the spur was not large. She had read Jules Verne as a child. She had taught children on Calderon's frontier to look up at the amber sky and understand that it was not the limit of what existed, and she understood what Emmett Cole was because she had spent her life believing that what he was possible. She had understood for days. She was angry that he hadn't trusted her with it sooner. She was also coming with him. I revised the load tolerance calculations in my head. The margin was tight. The margin was acceptable. I did not say anything about the margin, because there are moments when engineering considerations are not the primary variable. Kel was at the spur. He had come without being asked, and he had brought 2 men I didn't know by name but had seen in the square that morning. The 5 of us loaded the capsule onto the track and mounted the accelerant canisters to the hauler's firebox. Kel checked my canister installation without comment and adjusted one connection I had run slightly outside spec. "I used to work freight," he said, "before Calderon." "Thank you," I said. He shrugged in the way of someone who has decided a thing is worth doing and doesn't need it acknowledged. "Best use of my morning in 20 years, he said. We sealed the capsule. Doc and Clara were inside. I ran through the pre-ignition sequence once from the trackside panel, confirmed all the readings, set the countdown for 40 seconds. That was enough time to get clear. I got behind the blast barrier cargo containers, improvised, solid enough, and Kel and the 2 men came with me. I watched the countdown on my handheld unit. The last 10 seconds I wasn't watching the numbers. I was listening. The traction system engaged. I felt it through the ground before I heard it, that deep electromagnetic thrum, felt in the back teeth and the sternum rather than heard with the ears. Then the sound came up, the magnetic field interacting with the track, a rising harmonic that I had not heard before, and that was somehow both industrial and strange. The accelerant canisters caught. The output spike on my handheld was past rated capacity, past safe operating range, into the territory Doc's calculations said would hold for 90 seconds. The capsule moved. Slow at first, impossibly slow for what was supposed to happen next, and then not slow. The noise became enormous, the hauler and the accelerant, and the track vibrating at a frequency that sent fine dust skittering along the ground in little waves that moved outward from the rails like ripples. I watched the capsule recede down the track and hit the threshold marker in. The transit flash was blue-white. It lasted perhaps a quarter of a second. I saw it through the gap in the cargo containers, and it left a spot in my vision that took 90 seconds to fade. The hauler decelerated on its own. The track was empty. The morning was absolutely quiet. I let out a breath that I had apparently been holding for approximately 72 hours. The hauler decelerated on its own. The traction system cycling down without the capsule's weight ahead of it. The harmonic frequency dropped through the audible range and became felt again and then became nothing. The track was empty. The transit signature dissipated in the air above the rails, that faint shimmer like heat haze, and then that was gone too. I stood at the end of the spur and looked at the empty track for a moment. It is strange, the specific shape of relief when a thing you have been building toward is finished. Not celebration, not satisfaction exactly, just the particular silence that opens up when something that has been consuming all available space is suddenly no longer there. The Vethori vehicles came up the spur access road less than 3 minutes later, 3 of them fast. Tan was in the first one. He climbed out and stood on the access road and looked at the empty track and the faint residual shimmer of the transit signature still dissipating in the air above the rails. Then he looked at me. I stepped out from behind the cargo containers. Kel and the 2 men stayed where they were, which was tactically sound of them. There was nothing Tan could do. The transit was complete. The capsule was gone. Whatever violation of whatever provision had occurred, the individuals responsible were no longer within his jurisdiction and would not be again. He understood this. I understood this. The math was simple and we were both looking at it. He looked at me for a long time. I did not look away, and I did not look down, and I did not perform any particular emotion about what had happened or what he could or could not do about it. I just stood there, in the early morning light that was already going amber at the edges of the horizon, and let him look. "You will file a transit departure report," he said finally. "I'll file it today," I said. He got back in his vehicle. His people followed. The vehicles turned and moved back down the access road. I watched them until the dust they raised had settled. Kel came and stood beside me. We stood at the head of the empty track and looked at nothing in particular. "He's going to go through every provision of the compact now," Kel said. "Close every gap." "Probably. Takes time, though, closing gaps." "Yes," I said, "it does." He was quiet for a moment. The amber light was coming on fully now, the oversized sun clearing the ridge system, throwing its long warm light across the settlement and the spur, and the two of us standing at the end of an empty track. "We've known for 40 years that there were gaps in that compact," Kel said. "Knew where they were, more or less, just hadn't." He stopped. "Knowing and looking are different things," he said finally. "Yeah," I said, "they are." I filed the transit departure report that afternoon. I filed Tan's 2 correctional penalty assessments, for Doc and for me, both of them with the Colonial Authority ledger, attached to a formal note explaining the invocation of Provision 12, the legal basis, the recorded penalties, and the names of 40 witnesses present in the settlement square. I sent copies to 3 separate Colonial Authority offices and the Survey Corps legal desk. I included Ilara's annotated sensor map in a separate filing, categorized as field intelligence. Then I walked back into Pinehaven and sat in Kel's saloon and ate a meal for the first time in 3 days. Real food. Calderon's frontier had an agricultural situation I hadn't expected, actual grown things rather than processed rations. I sat with it and ate slowly and thought about everything that had happened and what it meant. What it meant for me was the return jump on the backup capsule that the Survey Corps sent 14 days later. What it meant for Pinehaven was slower and harder and cannot be reduced to any single event. But I have been in contact over the years with people who have been in contact with people who know things, and information travels in long chains across distances that make direct knowing impossible, and what I have heard in fragments across years, through the informal networks that carry news between places too far apart for formal channels, is this. Provision 12 was invoked 4 more times in Pinehaven in the 18 months after I left, by 4 different people who had looked it up. In the other 5 settlements in the Western Basin, it was invoked 7 times total over the next 2 years. The Colonial Authority began receiving an uncomfortable volume of formal records and documentation from Calderon's frontier, and documentation has a way of requiring response, and response is a different thing than silence. Tan requested a transfer to another sector 30 months after I left. The request was granted. I have thought a great deal about what happened in that square, about the 40 people who stood in the amber morning and watched, about Ilara, who had a map in her drawer for 20 years, about Kel, who adjusted the canister connection I'd run outside spec and didn't say anything about it, about the 2 men whose names I still don't know. They knew things. They had always known things, the exits and the provisions and the gaps and the leverage points that lived in the fine print of a compact designed to contain them. They had known these things and made their private calculations each morning and decided each morning that the cost of using the knowledge was more than they could carry. The cost was still high after I left. The Vethori were still there, and the compact was still in force, and the corrections continued, and the accommodations continued, and the mornings were still full of private arithmetic. I changed nothing structural. I was a courier who fixed things that broke and delivered things that mattered and spent 3 weeks on a frontier world that was not his and left when the window closed. But I have come to believe, and I would have been too young to say this at the time, I didn't have the words for it, that there is a difference between people who do not resist because they cannot and people who do not resist because they have forgotten they can. Those are not the same people. They look the same from outside. They make the same accommodations and lower their eyes the same way and carry the same weight. But they are not the same. What I saw in the square that morning, in 40 faces in the amber light, was the specific moment when that difference became visible to the people themselves. When they watched two men decline to be killed on schedule and walk away, and the thought arrived, not shouted, not announced, just arrived, that the knowledge had been there all along and the knowledge was usable. That the gap was real. That provision 12 was in the ledger and the ledger was real, and the math, if you ran it, came out differently than you had assumed. You cannot schedule that moment. You cannot engineer it into a plan or build it into a rig with a 90-second window. It happens when it happens, and you cannot know in advance which morning or which square or which two exhausted, underprepared people standing in the wrong place at the right time will be the thing that sets it off. But I was there when it happened, and that is something I carry. Doc sent me a letter eventually. Real letter, handwritten, 3 relay stations and a civilian courier service that charged a rate I remained slightly bitter about. It arrived 8 months after I got back, and it was long in the way his letters always were, technical in places, careful in others, full of the particular kind of information that had accumulated in his life and needed somewhere to go. He was well. Clara was well. He did not specify where they were, which I understood, and I did not ask. At the very end of the letter, after all the technical detail and the news and the careful language, was one sentence. It was not in his voice exactly. It had the sound of something that had been said to him, something he was passing along because he thought it needed passing. He wrote, "I have been told that the future is whatever you make it." I read that standing in the cargo bay of Relay Station 11, recycled air cold on my neck, and I thought about a man who built a life in a century that wasn't his and found something worth staying for. I thought about 40 people in a square remembering they had options. I thought about Kel at the canister connection, quiet and precise, and not making anything of it. Then I folded the letter and put it in my pocket and went back to work. That is where things like that belong, not preserved behind glass, not set on a shelf to look at. Carried, put in your pocket and taken with you into whatever comes next, because whatever comes next is the only place it does any good. The amber light never quite left my eyes. Even now, even here, I close them sometimes and it's still there, that wide, red-dusted sky. And the transit flash that was blue-white and brief and gone, and the empty track, and the morning.